China built ports in over 50 countries. And most people have no idea it even happened. Right now, more than 80% of everything you buy, your phone, your clothes, your furniture, traveled across an ocean before it reached you. That's not a shipping stat. That's a leverage point. And China figured that out before anyone else did. Here's what's wild. The combined cargo volume passing through Chinese-operated or Chinese-financed ports annually exceeds the entire GDP of Australia. You heard that right. The economic output of an entire continent, moving through infrastructure that Beijing either built, owns, or controls. This isn't about shipping lanes. It's about who gets to decide how the world moves its goods. And the answer, quietly, has become China. Here's what that actually means and why it should matter to you. The Quiet Empire. Imagine building a highway that stretches across every continent on Earth. Not metaphorically, literally constructing the physical roads, the rest stops, the fuel stations. Now imagine that every truck using that highway has to pass through your toll booth. That is what China has spent the last 2 decades doing. Except instead of highways, it's ports. And instead of toll booths, it's terminal lease agreements, state-backed loans, and long-term operational contracts that hand Beijing influence over the most critical nodes of global trade. But here's the part that should stop you cold. This didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen loudly. There were no headlines announcing that China was quietly positioning itself at the center of global logistics. There were no emergency summits, no coordinated international response. While the rest of the world was focused elsewhere, China was signing contracts, breaking ground, and planting its flag in port after port after port. By the time most governments realized what was happening, Chinese state-backed companies had already secured operational footholds in over 50 countries. Not just in developing nations desperate for infrastructure investment, but in Europe, in the Americas, in the Middle East. Everywhere global trade flows, you'll find a Chinese fingerprint on the dock. And this was just the beginning of something far larger than anyone anticipated. How BRI made it possible. To understand how China pulled this off, you need to understand the Belt and Road Initiative, because without it, none of this happens at scale. Launched in 2013, the BRI was framed publicly as a global infrastructure development program. Roads, railways, bridges, ports, China would finance and build the physical connections that developing nations couldn't afford on their own. On the surface, it looked like generosity. A rising power sharing its construction expertise and capital with the world. But underneath that framing was something far more calculated. The BRI gave China 3 things that were impossible to buy separately. First, it gave Beijing a financial instrument, state-backed loans channeled through policy banks like the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, deployed specifically to fund infrastructure that served Chinese strategic interests. Second, it gave China diplomatic cover. When a country accepts BRI funding, it also accepts a relationship with Beijing that makes public criticism of Chinese activity increasingly difficult. Third, and this is the part that matters most, it gave China long-term lease agreements and operational contracts on the ports it financed. You don't have to own something outright to control it. You just have to be the one running it. But the tension here is real. Many of these countries genuinely needed the infrastructure. Roads that didn't exist, ports that couldn't handle modern container ships. China stepped in where Western lenders wouldn't, and it did so fast. That speed, that willingness to build without the environmental reviews and governance conditions that Western institutions attach to their loans, that was the pitch, and it worked. 50+ countries signed on. Billions of dollars flowed. And quietly, methodically, China began building a physical network that connected the world's supply chains directly back to Chinese manufacturing. The companies doing the building weren't random contractors. They were instruments of the Chinese state, and what they built was far more than infrastructure. The companies building it. When you hear that China built a port in Greece, or Pakistan, or Kenya, you might picture a government delegation cutting a ribbon. But the real story is in the 2 corporate names that keep appearing everywhere you look: COSCO Shipping and China Merchants Group. These are not typical companies. COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, is one of the largest shipping conglomerates on the planet. It operates one of the world's biggest fleets and has quietly acquired or invested in terminal operations across dozens of ports globally. China Merchants Group, founded in 1872 and now fully state-owned, specializes in port development, terminal management, and logistics infrastructure. Together, these two entities are the operational arms of China's global port strategy. Here's what makes them different from any Western shipping company. They don't operate purely on commercial logic. They operate on a combination of commercial interest and national strategic interest, and when those two things conflict, national strategy wins. That's not speculation. It's built into their corporate structure. Both companies are ultimately accountable to the Chinese Communist Party, not to shareholders demanding quarterly returns. This means they can take losses on a port investment that a Western company would abandon. They can hold a lease for decades while waiting for the strategic value to mature. They can absorb short-term financial pain in exchange for long-term geopolitical positioning. No private Western firm can compete with that model because no private Western firm has a government willing to subsidize decades of strategic patience. And as these two companies spread across the globe, the map of their investments started to look less like a business portfolio and more like a carefully drawn strategic blueprint. That blueprint, when you lay it on a world map, tells a story that is impossible to ignore. The map that tells everything. Pull up a world map and start marking every port where China has a significant investment, operational contract, or ownership stake. What you see isn't random. It's a pattern so deliberate it looks like someone drew it with a ruler and a geopolitical strategy document. Start in Europe. The port of Piraeus in Greece, the largest port in the Mediterranean, is now majority owned by COSCO. From Piraeus, goods can move directly into European markets via rail. China didn't just buy a dock. It bought the front door to Europe's supply chain. Move east to the Indian Ocean. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka sits directly on one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, the route connecting East Asia to Europe via the Suez Canal. China financed it, built it, and then took it on a 99-year lease when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the debt. Gwadar Port in Pakistan, part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, gives China a potential outlet to the Arabian Sea, cutting thousands of miles off the route Chinese goods would otherwise have to travel. Move south to Africa. Ports in Djibouti, Kenya's Lamu Port, the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, all carry Chinese investment. Djibouti is particularly significant. It sits at the mouth of the Red Sea, one of the narrowest and most critical choke points in global shipping. China's first overseas military base also happens to be in Djibouti. Move to Latin America. Ports in Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Jamaica all carry Chinese involvement. The recently completed Chanquay port in Peru, built entirely by COSCO, is designed to handle the largest container ships in the world and effectively shortcuts the Pacific trade route between South America and China. This isn't a collection of business deals. It's a network. And the most powerful points in that network sit exactly where global shipping has no choice but to pass through. Choke points are everything. Here's something most people never think about. The global shipping system is not a wide-open ocean free-for-all. It is a series of narrow passages, choke points, through which nearly all international trade must pass. Control those choke points, and you hold leverage over the entire system. The Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, is the single most important shipping choke point on Earth. Roughly 80,000 vessels pass through it every year, carrying over a quarter of all global trade. There is no practical alternative route for ships moving between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. If the Strait of Malacca closes, global trade doesn't slow down, it collapses. China knows this better than anyone. In fact, Chinese strategists have a name for their vulnerability to this choke point: the Malacca Dilemma. If a rival power ever chose to blockade the strait, China's economy, which depends on imported oil and exported goods moving through that passage, would be strangled. So China's response has been methodical. Build port infrastructure on both sides of every critical choke point so that no single actor can ever hold China's trade hostage. Look at the Gulf of Aden, where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean. Chinese-linked port investments in Djibouti, Somalia, and along the East African coast cluster around this passage. Look at the approaches to the Suez Canal. Look at the South China Sea access points. Everywhere global shipping has no choice but to pass through a narrow corridor, you'll find Chinese infrastructure nearby. But what makes this strategy so powerful isn't just proximity. It's the engineering that goes into these ports, because what China builds at these locations isn't just a dock. It's something far more sophisticated than that. Engineering at massive scale. When China builds a port, it doesn't build a dock, it builds an ecosystem. And understanding the scale of that engineering is the only way to grasp why these investments create such lasting influence. Start with the physical infrastructure. Chinese-built ports are engineered for the largest container ships, currently operating vessels over 1,000 feet long, carrying over 20,000 containers in a single voyage. That requires deep water berths dredged to depths of over 50 feet, reinforced with engineered breakwaters designed to withstand storm surges and heavy seas. The construction timelines are aggressive. Hambantota was built in phases, but the core infrastructure went up in under 4 years. Chancay Port in Peru, a project that would have taken a Western contractor a decade, was delivered on an accelerated schedule driven by Chinese state-backed urgency. Then there's the automation. Modern Chinese-built container terminals deploy automated quay cranes, robotic-guided vehicles, and AI-driven logistics management systems. This isn't just efficiency, it's data. Every container that moves through an automated terminal generates information: origin, destination, contents, timing. The operator of that terminal has access to that information, and in Chinese-operated ports, the operator ultimately answers to Beijing. But the most strategically significant engineering isn't on the dock. It's what connects the dock to the interior. Chinese port projects almost always include inland connectivity rail links, road corridors, pipeline access, and special economic zones built directly adjacent to the terminal. At Gwadar, there's a proposed pipeline connecting the port to China's western Xinjiang region. At Piraeus, there's a rail corridor running north into Central Europe. At Lamu, in Kenya, there's a rail link connecting the coast to landlocked Ethiopia and South Sudan. These ports don't just move goods from ship to shore, they pull entire regional economies into China's logistics network. And once a country's infrastructure is integrated into that network, untangling it becomes extraordinarily difficult. But not every country accepted these terms without consequence, and the fallout from one particular port deal became the most important cautionary tale in global infrastructure history. The debt trap debate. In 2017, Sri Lanka handed China a 99-year lease on the port of Hambantota. The official framing was debt restructuring. The reality was something far more uncomfortable to look at directly. Sri Lanka had borrowed heavily from Chinese state-backed lenders to build the port. The revenue projections were optimistic from the start. The port sat underutilized, the debt mounted. And when Colombo couldn't service the loans, Beijing had a solution ready: hand over operational control of the port in exchange for debt relief. Sri Lanka signed. And with that signature, a strategic port sitting directly on one of the world's busiest shipping lanes passed into Chinese hands on a lease that won't expire until the 21st century is nearly over. The international reaction was immediate. Western governments, policy institutes, and journalists seized on Hambantota as proof of a deliberate Chinese strategy: lend more than a country can repay, wait for the default, then extract the asset. The term debt trap diplomacy entered the global vocabulary almost overnight, and China's entire BRI program was reframed through that lens. But here's the tension that the clean narrative skips over. Researchers at Johns Hopkins, the Brookings Institution, and other independent bodies who examined the Hambantota deal in detail found that the story was messier than the headline. Sri Lankan politicians made domestic decisions that inflated project costs. Multiple governments across different administrations took on the debt. The 99-year lease involved negotiating failures on the Sri Lankan side that had nothing to do with Chinese coercion. Some analysts argued that calling it a deliberate trap overstated Chinese strategic foresight and understated Sri Lankan political dysfunction. Does that mean the concern is unfounded? Absolutely not. Because whether the mechanism is deliberate predatory lending or simply Chinese strategic patience meeting recipient country mismanagement, the outcome is identical: a critical piece of infrastructure in a critical location under long-term Chinese operational control. The intention matters less than the result. And the result keeps repeating itself across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia with enough consistency that dismissing it as coincidence requires willful blindness. What makes Hambantota the defining case isn't just the debt. It's the location, it's the precedent, and it's the quiet signal it sent to every other country holding Chinese infrastructure loans about what the endgame might look like. The financial leverage is alarming enough on its own, but what China gains from these ports goes far beyond money, and that's where the stakes become truly staggering. Beyond trade its power. Here's where this stops being a story about shipping and becomes something that should genuinely unsettle you. When you operate a port terminal under a long-term lease, you gain things that never appear on a financial statement. You gain persistent physical presence inside a foreign country, infrastructure your personnel manage, your systems run, and your protocols govern. You gain visibility into cargo flows. What's moving, where it came from, where it's going, and what patterns emerge over time. Automated terminals generate enormous volumes of logistics data, and the entity operating those systems has access to that data. In Chinese-operated ports, that entity ultimately answers to Beijing. Then there's the dual-use question, and this is the part that keeps military strategists awake at night. China's first overseas military base is located in Djibouti, positioned directly adjacent to the Chinese-operated Doralay container terminal. That proximity is not accidental. Commercial port infrastructure provides logistics support, fuel access, maintenance facilities, and geographic positioning that naval planners spend entire careers trying to secure. The infrastructure already exists. The personnel are already there. In a moment of crisis, the line between a commercial terminal and a military logistics hub can disappear very quickly. American defense assessments, declassified and publicly available, identify this dual-use potential explicitly. The concern isn't that every Chinese-operated port is secretly a forward operating base. The concern is structural. The capability exists. It is controlled by entities that report to the Chinese Communist Party, and no legal firewall between commercial and strategic use has ever been independently verified. But the leverage doesn't require a single military move to be effective. Think about what it means for a government in East Africa or Southeast Asia when China operates its primary port, finances its main railway, and holds significant debt on both. That government is going to calculate very carefully before it votes against Beijing at the United Nations. It's going to weigh every word before criticizing Chinese activity in the South China Sea. It's going to think about what a disruption in port operations would mean for its economy before it sides with Washington on a sanctions resolution. The influence is invisible, structural, and nearly irreversible once the dependency is locked in. No shots fired, no treaties imposed. Just infrastructure sitting there, quietly reshaping what governments feel they can afford to say or do. And when the rest of the world finally woke up to what was happening, the response revealed exactly how large the gap had become. The world pushes back. By the early 2020s, the alarm bells were finally ringing. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and India had all watched China methodically embed itself into the world's port infrastructure for nearly 2 decades, and they had all, to varying degrees, underestimated how fast it was happening. Now they were scrambling to respond. The initiatives came quickly, announced with urgency and political weight. But urgency, it turned out, is a poor substitute for a 20-year head start. The United States launched the Blue Dot Network, a certification framework designed to promote high-quality, transparent infrastructure investment as an alternative to Chinese BRI financing. The G7 followed with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, committing $600 billion over 5 years to fund infrastructure projects in developing nations. The pitch was straightforward. Here is a Western alternative that comes with governance standards, environmental protections, and transparent loan terms. No debt traps, no 99-year leases, no strings attached to Beijing. It sounded compelling, but here's the problem no one wanted to say out loud. China wasn't just offering money, it was offering speed. When a developing nation needs a port built, it doesn't want a 5-year environmental review process and a governance audit. It wants cranes in the water and a functional terminal generating revenue. China delivers that. Western alternatives, burdened with the conditions that make them genuinely better deals on paper, consistently struggle to match that pace on the ground. India has been the most aggressive non-Chinese actor pushing back in the Indian Ocean specifically. New Delhi invested in Chabahar port in Iran, developed port capacity in Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Maldives, and has been explicit about viewing Chinese port expansion in its maritime neighborhood as a direct strategic threat. India calls it the String of Pearls, a network of Chinese-linked ports encircling the subcontinent. But India's financial firepower, while growing, cannot yet match the scale of Chinese state-backed capital deployment. Japan has moved more quietly but more consistently, using its development finance institutions to fund port upgrades across Southeast Asia and Africa with transparency conditions Chinese loans don't include. The European Union, after years of watching Chinese investment flow into member states Greece, Portugal, Belgium began tightening foreign investment screening rules and pushing back against further Chinese acquisitions of critical infrastructure inside European borders. The competition is real. The intention is serious. But then comes the brutal reality that no policy document wants to confront directly. You cannot win a race you didn't start running until your opponent was already crossing the finish line. China has operational footholds in over 50 countries. The terminals are built. The leases are signed. The inland rail corridors are laid. Replacing that infrastructure with Western alternatives isn't a financial negotiation. It's a political confrontation with Beijing that most small nations don't have the leverage, the appetite, or frankly, the time to pursue. The pushback is real, but what China has already built is more real. And what that means for the future of global trade is something the world is only beginning to fully reckon with. The center of everything. Here is what you now understand that most people walking past a shipping container have never once considered. Every time a vessel leaves a port on the East African coast, passes through the Gulf of Aden, clears the mouth of the Red Sea, transits the Suez Canal, and docks at Piraeus before its cargo moves inland by rail into Central Europe, there is a real and documented possibility that Chinese-built infrastructure, Chinese terminal operators, and Chinese logistics systems touched that shipment at multiple points along that route, not because China seized the route by force, because China built the shore that route now depends on. That is the strategy in its purest, most elegant form. You don't need to control the ocean. You need to control the port. You don't need to own every ship on the water. You need to own the terminal where those ships dock, refuel, and hand off their cargo. You don't need to dominate global trade outright. You just need to be structurally embedded in it at enough locations, across enough continents, that your presence becomes the baseline condition through which commerce moves. Over 50 countries. Hundreds of billions of dollars deployed through state-backed loans, equity investments, and operational contracts. Deep water berths engineered for the largest vessels on Earth. Automated terminals generating real-time logistics data. Inland rail corridors, and special economic zones stitching those ports into the economic fabric of entire regions. This isn't Belt and Road marketing material. This is the physical infrastructure that has been contracted, constructed, and operationalized over 2 decades, and it is not going anywhere. Here is what makes this so extraordinary. None of it was hidden. The contracts were signed by elected governments. The cranes bear the company logos. The loan agreements were published. The construction happened in full view. China executed the most significant infrastructure expansion in modern history without secrecy because it didn't need secrecy. It needed speed, capital, and a world that wasn't paying close enough attention. Right now, somewhere on the water, a container ship is moving through a passage flanked by Chinese-financed port infrastructure, carrying goods that will pass through a Chinese-operated terminal before reaching their destination. That is not a hypothetical. That is Tuesday. The country that builds the roads decides how the world moves. China made that decision 2 decades ago, acted on it with extraordinary discipline, and built it into the physical structure of the planet's logistics network. The rest of the world is still deciding whether it's too late to respond. The ports already have their answer.